All right, let's go ahead and get started. Just needed to wait a minute for the technology to work and for everybody to sign in. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the public launch of a new Perth USAsia Centre report, Australia, Japan, and India, a trilateral coalition in the Indo-Pacific. I'm particularly delighted today to extend both our thanks to and our welcome to those who have signed on, thanks to the support of the Organization Research Foundation in India and the National Institute for Defense Studies in Japan, who are co-sponsors today, given the topic very appropriately with us here in Australia at the Perth USAsia Centre. There are few topics that have garnered greater public attention in the broader Indo-Pacific realm over the last several years than the increasing cooperation between some of the drivers in this region. And if you look at that strategic triangle, my map behind me is not quite going to catch that, but Japan and India and Australia, from the very beginning, these three countries had a very important role to play. We're very fortunate to have with us today the two authors of this report, Dr. Priya Chacko and Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, to explain the report, some of their core findings. And then after they've kind of laid out the report, we're going to be hearing from two of our partners in the region, Dr. Rajeswari Rajagopalan at the Organization Research Foundation and Dr. Tomohiko Satake at the National Institute for Defense Studies. So if I can give just very short introductions, I think most of our panelists are known to our audience. Dr. Priya Chacko is a visiting research fellow at the Australia India Institute at the University of Melbourne, but as a senior lecturer at the University of Adelaide. And for our purposes at the Perth USAsia Centre, we're honored that this year she's serving as one of our Indo-Pacific fellows and appreciate her authorship of this particular report. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson obviously needs no introduction to our Perth USAsia Centre community. He is our Director of Research. Extremely prolific, peripatetic even, and highly productive in terms of his work in recent months on trade, on international resource issues, and helping us kind of sort through a lot of the regional structures and institutions that are so important to all the countries mentioned in the title today. And then just a minute, again, after the initial presentation of the report, we'll hear from again, Dr. Rajagopalan from the Organization Research Foundation, who also kindly serves as an Indo-Pacific Fellow with the Center, and Dr. Satake, who is not only has been strongly supportive of us today with this project, but was here in Perth with us just a year ago as we launched our first annual Japan Symposium. So we very much appreciate all of your support, and we appreciate all of you for joining us. I'm going to turn first to Priya to kind of set the context for the report, what motivated it, and then we'll hear from Jeff and proceed from there. So Priya, thank you. We appreciate you joining us from Melbourne, and over to you.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Raji and Tomo as well for agreeing to discuss this report with us. I wanted to start by explaining what Jeff and I were trying to do in this report. Our aim wasn't to advocate or cheerlead for an AGI coalition, and nor was it to critique or dismiss it. Our aim was more to assess what's realistically possible for the AGI coalition. And we do this in the report by identifying what's brought the coalition together, what it's done so far, and what the challenges and opportunities are that it faces. And finally, we have some recommendations based on what we think is the art of the possible for the coalition in the future. So I'll begin by outlining what we think are the foundations of the coalition, and then Jeff will discuss the art of the possible and the opportunities and challenges for the coalition. So the AGI coalition is one of many trilateral coalitions that have sprung up over the last few years, and this has been, in part at least, a response to the failure of existing multilateral institutions to provide effective platforms for international cooperation. But we think AGI is one of the more significant ones, and that's for two reasons. The first reason is that the three governments have been quite consistently enthusiastic about the coalition. All three countries have declared their support for a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Now, to be sure, this phrase means something slightly different for each of the countries. For Australia, geographically, the Indo-Pacific means Asia-Pacific plus India, and its primary ocean of concern is the Pacific Ocean. For India and Japan, the Indo-Pacific links the entire Indian Ocean region with the Asia-Pacific, but India's primary concern is the Indian Ocean, while the Pacific is secondary. All three countries emphasise inclusiveness as a way to deflect criticisms that the Indo-Pacific is a containment strategy against China, but their emphasis on who's included is slightly different. For Australia and Japan, their formal alliance partner, the United States, is an essential player in the region. India is mostly fine with the United States in the region, but its enduring commitment to strategic autonomy means that the influence of the US needs to be balanced. So India gives Russia a place in the Indo-Pacific as well. And India tends to see the Indian Ocean more exclusively as its domain. Nonetheless, despite these differences, there are some basic commonalities in their objectives. All three countries highlight the importance of rules and regional multilateralism through ASEAN institutions. All are concerned about future Chinese dominance in the region, but all desire a constructive Chinese role in the region. And all three agree that India should be better integrated into key regional institutions. The second reason why we think AGI is a significant trilateral coalition is because of the rapid expansion of cooperative mechanisms between the three countries. This cooperation began way back in 2004 after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and it included the United States, and it was focused on disaster relief coordination. This evolved into the infamous quadrilateral grouping a few years later, infamous because it became mired in controversy due to Chinese objections and the wavering commitment of its members. It was after the Quad went into hiatus in 2007 that we saw a real flourishing of bilateral cooperative initiatives between India, Japan, and Australia. The foundation of these initiatives are bilateral strategic partnerships and annual 2+2 meetings of defence and foreign ministers. And these have enabled a range of functional cooperation agreements across defence and economic domains. By our count, since 2007, Japan and Australia have signed 13 bilateral agreements spanning defence, security and economics. Japan and India have signed 15, and Australia and India have signed 15. We argue in the report that these bilateral bottom-up agreements for functional cooperation have worked to form the basis of the AGI coalition. And we argue that these agreements have put in place the diplomatic infrastructure required for trilateral coalitional diplomacy. Having said that, if we take a slightly closer look at the bilateral relationships, there are some notable asymmetries. The Australia-Japan relationship is the most established and economic cooperation is the focus, but there's also a strong security element with the signing of several bilateral defence agreements since 2015. The India-Japan relationship has grown particularly rapidly in the past 5 years, and it now matches the Australia-Japan relationship in terms of the density of its cooperative mechanisms. Economic, technology and development cooperation features prominently in this relationship, which makes it particularly meaningful for India given its economic needs. The weakest bilateral relationship is the Australia-India plank, and this is reflected in the rhetoric. Australia and Japan and India and Japan have strategic partnerships that have been deemed to be special strategic partnerships. But India and Australia's strategic partnership is not considered special, it's just deemed to be a comprehensive partnership, comprehensive strategic partnership. And even this is more of an aspiration rather than a reality. India and Australia did recently sign a defence cooperation agreement to bolster their security cooperation, but their economic links are underdeveloped and they're going backwards. There have also been a couple of missed opportunities to foster greater cooperation. One is the Malabar naval exercises involving Japan, India and the US. Australia's been anxious to join Malabar for some time now, but it's been repeatedly rebuffed by India. And depending on who you ask, this either reflects the lack of trust in the Australia-India relationship, or Indian deference to Chinese sensitivities, or India not wanting to give the impression of militarising the Quad. The second missed opportunity is India's withdrawal from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement on the basis of concerns that joining would further widen its trade deficit with China. And this particularly frustrated Australia's desire for closer economic relationships with India through multilateral mechanisms. Both of these decisions, in different ways, I think, reflected India's continued desire for strategic, political and economic autonomy. And as Jeff will further explain, this remains one of the key challenges for the AGI Trilateral going forward. And it's over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. Before you speak, let me just chime in here and say that Priya set a very high bar, because by taking this acronym and pronouncing it as AGI, she's kind of coined something that's just really, really important. Because when I first arrived in Perth 7 years ago, I had never heard of the term Aji Baji, you know, and so by calling this the Aji relationship, it makes me worry about what the Baji other side of it is. And so I'm going to add that to the list of tasks that Priya has just handed over to you as you wrap up this report. So.
How does one follow that? Thanks, Gordon. Look, thanks everyone. Look, as Priya has outlined, our report argues that the foundations for trilateral cooperation between the AGI group have already really been laid down in the last decade. It's there, it's a thing, it's real. But as she finished in the comments, there has been some mixed results with some successes alongside a couple of missed opportunities. And here we argue that it's important to remember that having a shared outlook on the Indo-Pacific doesn't mean these governments have perfectly overlapping interests. And indeed, those differing interests do impose distinct limits on what the coalition can and can't achieve. So a second half of our report really looks to the future for the coalition in coming years, asking this as the question of what are the constraints that need to be recognised and what is the art of the possible. Looking into the security space first, maritime cooperation is the obvious avenue for their future security agenda. All three governments have made defending rule of law for maritime issues a key part of their Indo-Pacific rhetoric, particularly in terms of freedom of navigation. They're all active supporters of using international legal mechanisms such as UNCLOS to deal with these issues. With the exception of the Malabar gap, there is an existing suite of naval exercises at the bilateral level between the governments. And we'd argue there's also a bit of a useful geographic division of labour on maritime, because they each mark out a regional anchor point. Japan in the north of the Indo-Pacific, Australia in the south, and India in the west. They're kind of the three anchor points of which the region is built. That said, there are also major differences in their approach to both maritime and broader security issues that do need to be recognised. Priya has mentioned that Australia and Japan have a security posture based squarely around their alliances with the US, where India has a more independent outlook based on the doctrine of strategic autonomy. There are also differences in their geographic priorities. They all share a concern regarding things going on in the South China Sea, but to be realistic, India's greatest risks are in the Indian Ocean, Japan's in the East China Sea, and Australia on its sea lanes of approach in the north. In a context where this year we've seen China using economic sanctions for diplomatic coercion far more than it ever has, they also face differing levels of exposure to Chinese pushback. Australia is very trade exposed to China at about a third of national exports, where India only sits at 11% and Japan somewhere in the middle at 21%. So these differences mean that while the AGI governments might view regional security issues in a similar manner, they prioritise their interests differently and also face distinct constraints on what is feasible action. In the economic domain, that's often cited as a really key opportunity. And if you read our reports, it actually shows that economic issues appear frequently in the emerging coalitional architecture. But there does remain a major fault line in the economic interests of the group. Australia and Japan are mostly on the same economic page, and this reflects their common status as mature developed economies. They're committed trade liberalisers and also favour a more ambitious or sometimes called 21st century economic agenda that deals with issues such as investment, digital commerce and intellectual property. India, it's fair to say, is not on this page. It has much higher levels of trade protection and is presently pursuing a Make in India program that actually requires protectionist rather than a liberalising direction of policy. And as a developing country, it has far less interest in those 21st century type issues that Australia and Japan prioritise. India's recent departure from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP agreement, illustrates this tension perfectly. India withdrew from the agreement despite assiduous and significant lobbying from both the Australian and Japanese governments on a personal level by former Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, and some fairly generous concessions during negotiations. So it's extremely unlikely that India is going to participate in trade agreements that meet Australia and Japan's ambitions in the future. That said, trade's only part of the economic story, and there are a number of functional economic agendas that are probably a better fit for the shared interests of the AJI group than trade. One's infrastructure, where there's a complementary division of labour between Australia and Japan's capabilities as donors and India's attractiveness as an investment destination. This India and Japan's infrastructure partnership is already well established, and that provides a model that could be extended more broadly in the region, certainly to include Australia. Another's critical minerals, which are essential for both the future of the Japanese and Indian manufacturing sectors. While these governments presently rely on China for nearly all their supply, Australia is extraordinarily well endowed in the critical minerals they need. And a more recent one is value chain security. All three governments have been on the receiving end of Chinese trade sanctions in recent times and are working to build more diversity into their trade relationships. Indeed, only a few weeks ago, the three agreed to develop a supply chain resilience initiative that could be extended to other partners in the region as well. So what this suggests is that economic cooperation amongst the AJI coalition is far from impossible, but it needs to be carefully calibrated to the actual landing point all three can agree on. So just to conclude our presentation today, we finish with this question of what's the art of the possible for the coalition in coming years? Priya and I argue that the coalition has been and will continue to be a useful vehicle for the governments to realise their shared Indo-Pacific outlooks, but equally that it shouldn't be overloaded with excessive ambitions either. Their shared outlook doesn't mean they have identical or near identical interests, and their differential positions with respect to security, economics, China and the US often mean there are real and understandable constraints on what they can bring to the table for certain issues. So the art of the possible lies in building an agenda where both the outlooks and the interests are aligned. We conclude our report by suggesting a few principles that could inform how that shared agenda can be discovered in coming years. One idea is that informal mechanisms will work better than formal treaty-type instruments. Informal mechanisms such as dialogues and technical cooperation platforms are better calibrated to diplomatic and domestic constraints facing the countries, and certainly raise fewer concerns around AJI being some kind of anti-China bloc. Security cooperation needs to tread a fine line between the kind of responses that governments will see from both the US and China. It will be constrained by Australia and Japan's commitment to the US alliance, India's commitment to strategic autonomy, and their different forms of economic interdependence with China. These factors are going to continue to shape security policy for the foreseeable future, and so their trilateral initiatives will need to be designed with those constraints in mind. And we'd also argue that economic cooperation could do a lot, but it really needs to be bottom-up and functionally oriented to accommodate the differing outlook of India vis-a-vis Australia and Japan. A greater awareness of domestic priorities will help us avoid expending energy on initiatives that are likely to encounter sensitivities. So in sum, Australia, Japan and India have already begun functioning as a powerful minilateral coalition in the Indo-Pacific and have the capacity to do more in coming years. The next step, we argue, is to avoid overburdening the coalition with unrealistic expectations and focus on functional cooperation in areas where both outlook and interests align. Thanks.
Well, Priya, Jeff, thank you. It is a wonderfully insightful report. So often these minilateral or trilateral relationships are only understood in the realm of media commentary or kind of bromides in political speech. And you've given us some details in terms of what's actually happening, and more importantly, a roadmap for what could and should happen going forward. I appreciate it. Now, let me note that, again, thanks to our partners in today's endeavor, the Organization and Research Foundation and the National Institute for Defense Studies, we had over 300 registrants from this event from 16 different countries. And I don't presume that everybody knows 16 countries is familiar with the term aji-baji, which in Australia it means an argument or a dispute. When I first arrived here, I thought that was mildly racist. I assumed it came somewhere out of the region. Aji-baji was just, to argue in a marketplace, when it turns out it actually comes from an old Scottish saying, argy bargy or argle bargle. And so it's Scot in that regard, and thereby with us Australian ancestry from the beginning of the settlement here has some claim to it. So now we're going to turn to some reactions from our partners in today's launch. We'll start with you, Dr. Rajeswari Rajagopalan from Delhi. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon, and good morning and good afternoon. Thank you to the Perth USAsia Centre for having me for this online discussion on this important trilateral I'll try and provide an Indian perspective. And many congrats to both Priya and Jeffrey for putting this report together. So of course, the initial thoughts, I think, came out of the conference we had in February, some of which we were a part of that. But I think it's a good moment to take a look at where we are heading with this particular trilateral. And I'll try and give an Indian perspective. So when I look at it, I think it's been now 4 months plus since the Indian and Chinese military forces have been engaged in a border standoff in Ladakh on the western sector of the Sino-Indian border, including the killing of 20 Indian soldiers and an unconfirmed number of the Chinese forces as well. And a few weeks ago, there were shots fired by both sides. So in a sense, when you look at this India-China dynamics, we have broken several records of sorts which have been prevalent for the last several decades in a sense. So I would imagine that it cannot be business as usual for India-China relations and after the Galwan clash. In fact, Ashley Tellis, for instance, put it out saying that Sino-Indian relations can never go back to the old normal. They will reset with greater competitiveness and in ways that neither country had actually intended at the beginning of this crisis. So I think all I'm trying to say is Galwan clash is a game changer for India as far as its view towards China is concerned. So there is a sort of a pre-Galwan, post-Galwan moment in India's foreign and security policies and strategic engagements. In the post-Galwan Indian foreign policy and security realm, India is more antagonistic towards China. Therefore, in a sense, almost as a result, willing to create and nurture Indo-Pacific partnerships, including trilaterals, Quad, and other minilaterals in the Indo-Pacific region. India has shown greater commitment to groupings such as the Quad, which is going to be meeting in Tokyo next month for the ministerial level engagements. There is also a Quad Plus engagement that is taking shape. But even so, I would add that there is some hesitancy and tendency to developing normal relations with China. At least this is somewhat evident in the bilateral relations, but it's unlikely to go back to a Wuhan moment, the Wuhan sentiments and so on and so forth. But there is still some tendency within the Indian establishment to establish some sort of normalcy with China, that there is a sense that you cannot break off from China completely, given that we are immediate neighbors and so on and so forth. So, but I think today India is showing a relatively greater willingness to engage in all kind of formulations. Trilaterals, Quad, and other minilaterals taking shape in the region. Because and I think these are taking important shape because if you look at the AJI, each of the countries in this trilateral has dealt with China's aggressive behavior in its own backyard, be it the use of force in dealing with territorial and sovereignty-related issues or economic and trade coercion as seen against Australia. Different minilaterals and India has been part of have been primarily security-oriented and not necessarily economic. But I believe that these could take very many different shapes. These could focus on various vulnerabilities and start certain initiatives to address them. And I think COVID-19, for instance, has brought home some of the bitter truths about China. For all the rhetoric about its peaceful rise and common destiny and so on and so forth, its behavior since the beginning of 2020 in particular has shown the worst face of China. And this has made us acknowledge, as the report rightly highlights, the danger of relying on a single source and therefore the importance of the global supply chain. So supply chain diversification and resilience has become an important issue for us, prompting, of course, the recent resilient supply chain initiative in a sense. So, and while proposing this trilateral, Prime Minister Modi came out and said, reshaping global supply chains should be based on trust and stability. We still don't know how this is going to pan out, but I think it could be pretty impactful. In the short term, from an Indian perspective, I think this is not going to be easy. Many even question the feasibility of this particular exercise in the short term, in the near term. But for India, I think it has come to a point where even the elite opinion makers, in particular, actually the elite opinion makers, have made it amply clear that India will need to bite the bullet and take some hard decisions. And because of the economic impact of such steps by India to keep China out will be significant on India more than anything else. It is still not looking at a decoupling scenario, but a significant reduction in terms of India's reliance on China, at least to the extent possible. But I think it's going to be easier for China to cut off India from its supply chain, because India primarily exports primary commodities. And so China can replace India with a lot more ease. But at the same time, for India to kind of find alternative supply chains, I think this is going to be difficult. Again, this is not a problem unique to India, but it's the same problem that others have felt and others have dealt with. And that brings me to the point as India and other key countries need to seriously take steps to diversify and move away from China. And here is the need for the Indo-Pacific powers to come together, take conscious decision to diversify their over-dependence on China and engage with each other, even in the face of some difficulties. And I think the difficulties, for instance, when I look at India, the economic investment climate, the labor issues, and range of land acquisition issues, there are going to be a million problems. But if we can take a conscious decision to make this an important agenda, a priority for the three countries, at least in the AGI grouping, I think that'll be a good start in the longer term, in the medium to longer term. And another area, again, highlighted in the report is the maritime security and ensuring freedom of the seas in the Indo-Pacific waters. Again, this is not all about the navies and the collaboration, but I think what is more important is in terms of norm entrepreneurship as identified in the report. Respect for international law, free, open, rules-based, inclusive Indo-Pacific. I think that's what we are all aiming at, especially the trilateral grouping is aiming at. So the key question is, how do we develop and nurture key norms of responsible behavior in the maritime spaces in the Indo-Pacific region? And I would start by saying that again, there has been some bit, especially when you look at the Indian narrative, people have started talking about as to how we need to engage in joint military exercises, even coordinated patrols in the Indo-Pacific waters. India has traditionally resisted some of these kind of steps, but I think the Chinese aggressive actions on the borders and elsewhere are pushing India to at least relatively embrace these kind of bolder steps in a sense. But for me, I think something more important is to ensure greater coordination in monitoring the Indo-Pacific maritime spaces. Monitoring these waters has become very important for each of the three countries. And I think that's going to be important. And we could start with developing certain arrangements among the three countries. This has worked in the past in different formats and in a narrow fashion, for instance, on issues like anti-piracy. So I think there is a sort of a rough format that is available for us to expand on. And I think this is where we also need to talk about division of labor and burden sharing so that we are able to effectively monitor China's naval activities in the Indo-Pacific waters. There could be arrangements like India can take care of the Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean, and others can sort of divide which are the areas of priority and where their capability can be exercised. Because I think this is important, because while the individual capacities of the three nations remain inadequate to secure the whole region in an independent fashion, there is a clear case, therefore, for trilateral cooperation and a coordination among the three navies. The navies of Australia, India, and Japan are the ones in the region with the tonnage and diversity to be able to address some of the broad range of maritime responsibilities and roles in the Indo-Pacific region. There are challenges, but I'm going to stop here and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raji. That's fantastic. We're going to now turn to Dr. Tomohiko Satake, again, a senior fellow at the National Institute for Defense Studies in Japan, and again, one of our kind partners for today's event. Tomo, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Well, first of all, congratulations for publishing this wonderful report. I'm sure this is the best report ever on this topic, and I hope this masterpiece will be read by many people who are interested in this trilateral framework or ASI or whatever. Japan has changed its prime minister quite recently, but I think Japan will continue to pursue FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, even under the new government, because I think this FOIP is Japan's kind of organized response to this long-term, changing geostrategic reality, rather than the prime minister's, personal initiative. So that's why I think, FOIP will endure even under the new government. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, Japan can achieve FOIP. To realize FOIP, Japan needs to invest more money, more people, and maybe more partnerships with regional like-minded countries. And in that respect, I think this report contains many hints for the Japanese government, to further enhance our Indo-Pacific partnerships. Having said that, one thing you didn't clarify in this report is a little bit fundamental point. That is, what is this relationship for in the first place? Why do we need to have this trilateral framework? Although we have a quadrilateral security framework, including the United States, and you actually briefly mentioned the Trump factor, which might be true, but this framework was actually established before the emergence of Trump administration. I think the first senior officials meeting was held in July 2015. And also, you wrote that kind of defending the freedom of navigation and rule of law, common interests of these three countries, which is absolutely correct. But if that is so, perhaps Quad is more useful and probably more a forceful framework to maintain, freedom of navigation and rule of law, because obviously, it includes the United States. Nevertheless, what is the point to make a trilateral framework that does not include the United States? So that's a question I'd like to propose. And to be honest, I don't have any clear answer, to this question, but I have two hypotheses. The first one is, especially from Japanese point of view, this trilateral is quite valuable to encourage closer India-Australia cooperation, which is the weakest link of Quad, as Priya and Jeff mentioned. The India-Australia security cooperation remains quite weak, compared to Japan-Australia or Japan-India cooperation. Japan concluded AXA with India quite recently, and India also concluded some logistical agreement with Australia. But that is not legally binding, unlike AXA, I think. So this relationship is still premature. And also, India is cautious about the cooperation of Quad, not only because it could antagonize China, but also it could reduce, India's autonomy. So having trilateral, rather than quadrilateral cooperation can help to enhance India-Australia bilateral security cooperation without so much, caring about losing autonomy. And I think Japan can be a kind of good, honest broker, between these two countries, and that may eventually lead to the enhancement of Quad. That's my first theory. But that is not to say that this trilateral is simply a supplement of Quad. I don't think India is happy about this kind of idea, and that comes to my second point. I think this trilateral can potentially strengthen the so-called regional middle power cooperation. And all regional middle powers, more or less share some concern or dilemma between security dependence on the United States and economic dependence on China. So I think enhancing middle power cooperation could mitigate this dilemma and increase some, middle powers a greater autonomy in terms of both security and economy. So that's why I'm very interested in the so-called SCRI, Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which was not, mentioned in this report, inevitably. And I think this, initiative can diversify three countries' options and reduce their dependence on a single country. And more interestingly, this initiative doesn't include the United States. And maybe the US might join later. I don't know anything about that, but probably it's easier for three countries, especially for India, to start from this middle power initiative that does not include the United States. And India is, of course, more receptive to Japanese investment than those from the United States. And I heard this network is planning to expand to ASEAN, countries in the future. So if that realized, I think this can be a very kind of meaningful framework of regional middle powers to enhance their resilience against any future strategic shocks, including the sudden US-China conflict or something like that. So to sum up, encouraging Australia-India cooperation and strengthening regional middle power cooperation, these are two things why we need this trilateral framework. But of course, this is my just personal opinion, so I'd like to hear your view on this, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tomo. Your two questions fit very well into those that we received from the audience. For those who have registered in advance of this event, I think we had some 40 of you who submitted questions in advance, which, number one, Priya and Jeff implies having read or some deep interest in the topic itself. And you won't be surprised to know that by my count, about a third of the questions that were submitted echo those raised by Tomohiko Satake. And that is the relationship between AJI, or the Australia, Japan, India trilateral, and the Quad. We had one question, just to give you an example. Dr. Rebea Brauer from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, who's based in Tokyo right now, said, what is the benefit of leaving the US out? Is it because of Trump's uncertain policies? And a lot of others echoed that same line, very articulately questioned by Tomo as well. So maybe we'll start with you, Priya. And then I want to bring Raji into this as well, because Raji's written extensively on the Quad, including for us earlier this year. Priya, why don't we start with you? What's the relationship between what we've discussed today and the Quad?
I think Tomo actually hit the nail on the head with his answers to those questions, actually. I think for a country like India, I think one of the reasons why it's uncomfortable with the Quad is because it introduces a power hierarchy. The United States is much more powerful than these three countries, and India doesn't like hierarchies. So it sort of tries to avoid those sorts of alignment relationships, whereas this trilateral is very much more suited to the types of coalitions that it likes. And it likes to slip on different sorts of identities. The RIC trilateral is India's identity, bucking the system, challenging the system. The J trilateral, the Japan, America, India trilateral, is India trying to be a great power. This one is a middle power coalition for India, and it does for Australia. I think it's slightly different. I think it is about trying to engage India in a multilateral sort of format to improve things like the economic relationship, which has been struggling. And the same thing with Japan. I think this is about trying to improve the relationship with India particularly. So I think the Quad is very much, it is just a separate mechanism which has a completely different power dynamic. And that's why this trilateral should be seen as separate. And it's going to change the dynamic quite significantly if we brought the United States in. And I'm not sure that any of these countries are willing to do that, because it serves different purposes in terms of their foreign policy strategies.
Fantastic. Jeff, anything to add to that? Then we'll go to Raji.
Well, one quick observation is the origin of the AJI historically was when the Quad was in abeyance. So this was partially, well, if we can't do Quad, let's do this. And in the meantime, we did this while the three of us had our bilateral relationship in the Australia-Japan case, an alliance one with the US. But I think, and to be cheeky here, there is questions around the Trump administration in the US aside. The US has a different view of the region. It's a long way away. It's a global superpower. And this coalition can be an opportunity for Australia, Japan and India to line their ducks up with respect to other parties. It could function as a pre-caucus meeting for the three smaller Quad players before a Quad meeting, for example. And to some extent, as Priya said, provide almost a bandwagoning hedge against US domination of the Quad agenda by making sure that that's not just we're all having a discussion with the United States, but if the three of us are on the same page, that makes it much easier. Whoever the next US president is or the one after that, it provides the governments a middle power leverage with respect to the US that they wouldn't have if it didn't exist.
Thank you. Raji, anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, I just had, I agree entirely with Priya and Jeffrey, but I think I want to add another element of, I think, why the preference for these kind of AJI and other trilateral taking place in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think it comes from the fact that there's a fact of the Cold War politics and the leftover of that history lingering in a sense. So there is certain amount of suspicion when it comes to the US and generally the Western countries. The Western Australia did suffer from that in its relationship with India for a long time, but I think we have gotten past that. There is a greater trust and confidence in each other. The kind of transformation that we have seen, even in a short period of time, I think that that's a proof of that transformation in the relationship. So I think in addition to the point about the ideology and to the having the middle powers come together and the power differential that comes along with the US being there, I think for me, the ideological hangover and the Indian foreign policy establishment that has had the suspicion of the West and the US, I think that is even more important, it seems to me. And I think for the other point, I think Tomo also mentioned is the, in case of some major event that the US were to dilute, for instance, its influence and presence in the Indo-Pacific, there has to be a capable grouping that is able to take charge rather than leave a power vacuum out there. And I think in terms of the maritime capabilities, I think you have again 3 of the more capable powers coming together, and I think therefore it makes sense. But I think I can absolutely see the middle power sort of initiative, which is also gaining greater traction on a number of different platforms and thematic issues in a sense. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Tomo, Japan has played a very important role doing exactly the activities that Jeff and Priya have commented on, kind of holding the door open for the United States and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, resurrecting it, a lot of these trilateral things. Anything else that you would add to the responses you received from Priya, Jeff, or Raji on that?
No, I mean, basically totally convinced by what everyone said. But I think one of the virtues of this unilateral thing is a kind of a symmetrical, equal partnership between regional middle powers. Because when it comes to Quad, you tend to lose your autonomy because the United States is really big and there's a kind of asymmetrical relation between United States and regional powers. But we can have this symmetrical relationship. So that's a kind of an important, feature of this trilateral.
Thanks. Now, I've got a long list of questions, both coming in now and that came in previously, but one I want to jump to quite quickly, and it comes from Munir Majid, who's with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council in Malaysia, and he asks, why so little discussion of ASEAN? So one of the interesting characteristics of this trilateral is that in the middle of that triangle between India and Japan and Australia is ASEAN in the center, and it has been the focus of a lot of the discussions, but it hasn't come out today. Maybe we'll start with you, Jeff, on this one. What is the role of ASEAN? Is it just a focal point for the trilateral, or what is its role in this AGI initiative?
Thanks, Gordon, and thanks for the question, Mani. I think most of the audience in this presentation today would be familiar that the Indo-Pacific has an ASEAN-centered institutional architecture, whether it's ASEAN, the +3, the +6, the East Asia Forum, the ASEAN Regional Forum. Everything at a multilateral level in Asia comes back to ASEAN. And so what that means in architectural senses is there's a lot of strong links around that edge to that, but what you have is fewer links kind of around the outside. Something like an AJI trilateral coalition, or, Priya mentioned some of the other ones. There's some talk in Australia at the moment of an Australia, India, Indonesia one going on as well. So this is, we'd argue AJI is the most developed trilateral, but not the only one in existence. But what a lot of these are trying to do is kind of build the edge around an ASEAN-centered regional diplomacy, because ASEAN has its own objectives, certain ways it wants to do things and its priorities, which are natural. But for Australia, Japan and India, they are relegated to +X partnerships in making that phrase. And we see that every year in the November summit season, where ASEAN goes first, and then there's the +3, then there's the +6 if we get one for RCEP, and then we get the East Asia Summit where the Russians and Americans turn up, right? What these minilaterals, and AJI has done it more than any of the others, is try and actually build things so it's not simply ASEAN plus a couple of others, is not the standard way everything is dealt with in the region.
Thank you. Priya, anything to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think one of the criticisms of ASEAN is that it's, doesn't do very much. And forming these new trilateral relationships is a way to get ASEAN to work in different ways and maybe make it more active in conflict, management and managing other types of issues. And I also think it's a way to not get ASEAN offside as well. Every statement on the Indo-Pacific talks about the centrality of ASEAN institutions. We know that ASEAN as an institution is very sensitive to being sidelined in its own region. And I think so these states that are forming new trilaterals have to put ASEAN at the centre in order to not alienate other countries in that region.
So let's bring the security element into that as well in terms of ASEAN. We'll start with you, Tomo, then go to you, Raji.
I think I was the only one who mentioned to ASEAN in my presentation, but
well done. You get a gold star from us.
But as I said, SCRI, is planning to expand to ASEAN, which is really important because Japan's supply chain diversification target at ASEAN, not at India, indeed, like countries like Thai or Vietnam. So if you can involve ASEAN into this cooperation, that's going to be really, meaningful framework. And as I said, that's a kind of middle power cooperation. So whether ASEAN is a Chinese or not, I think it's very important to include ASEAN.
Thank you, Raji.
Yeah, I think ASEAN will continue to be important in our conversations around the Indo-Pacific, but I think we are also trying multiple minilaterals because I believe a flurry of minilaterals groupings is better than having none or having just one or two, in a sense that bring in the different, combines the different strategic interests of major major actors in the region. So while ASEAN will continue to be an important player, an important factor in the AJI conversation as well, and of course, especially when you look at the Global Supply Chain Resilience Initiative and so on and so forth, Vietnam, countries like some of the ASEAN countries have actually a greater role to play than India, but I think India is also trying to kind of diversify, and I think that's where. But otherwise, I believe that we need to start with a smaller number of countries before expanding it, because then if you have that many more countries enter ASEAN, and ASEAN doesn't itself present itself as a sort of a unified voice and unified platform anymore. It's a very divided house. So in a sense, ASEAN's centrality is important, but I think bringing the entire ASEAN together is going to be challenging. I think there are important capable powers who will be engaging with these kind of trilaterals in a more effective fashion. Like Jeff mentioned, India, Australia, and Indonesia are one possible triangle that has gained greater traction in the recent years because for the kind of challenges we have faced in the region.
Well, thank you. You won't be surprised that, again, another full third of the questions that we received in advance were focused on China, whether or not the AJI was ganging up on China or response to China. I'll pull out one specific questioner, is Abdiri Sarak Mohammed Chacko from Ankara, Turkey. And he frames it, is the coalition between these three countries in order to balance the power of China? Raji, I'm going to start with you on this one because your initial remarks focused heavily on a pre-Galwan Valley, post-Galwan Valley view in India. So India's views on this might have shifted the most. And we'll go to you, Toma, and then back to Jeff and Priya. So Raji, to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the China factor is very large in the Indian thinking, Indian conceptualization. And for instance, India joining the Quad, India joining the trilaterals, minilaterals in the region is driven by what China is doing. And China, so there's a lot of onus that rests on China. Having said that, I think I also need to add the fact that even as India is getting more excited about these groupings, these minilaterals in the Indo-Pacific, India also has been warming up to the RIC, the Russia, India, China grouping, or the BRICS, and so on and so forth. Even in the middle of the pandemic, the Indian foreign minister and the defense minister traveled to Russia for these meetings, in a sense. So it does show that India is still trying to sort of put its foot in multiple camps, which may not be very helpful when you actually have a serious problem to confront with on the border or elsewhere in the Indonesian region. But the China factor, and if today, tomorrow, if things go, because we have been sort of engaged with the Chinese diplomatically and militarily to have to find some sort of a resolution to the Galvin clash. We haven't found one till now. It's almost 5 months now. And should things turn really quite bad and result in a war, then I think you are going to have a major shift in the Indian foreign policy. But I think what China does will continue to have an important bearing in how India fashions its foreign and strategic engagements in a sense.
Thanks. Tomo, this is not new from Japan's strategic perspective either.
Well, yeah, I think you could say it's a balance of power relationship, but which doesn't necessarily mean that we are trying to contain China. Of course, to maintain a good relation with China, you need a stable power balance in the region. If China continues to expand in the region, if China keeps invading our territory or something, then it's going to be really difficult for Japan to have a constructive engagement with China. So that's the reason why I think we try to maintain a stable regional balance. And also, that's not the only reason why we have this trilateral. As everyone said, like a functional cooperation between regional middle powers is quite important. And that doesn't, not only include some traditional security, but also some non-traditional security issues, or even maritime environment is very important. And nobody mentioned about global public health, but that's going to be really important agenda for these three countries. So I think, there are many faces in this trilateral. I don't think it's wise to decide this is the role of trilateral things. Thank you.
Jeff and Priya, quick responses?
Two observations, one historical and one prospective. Historically, this coalition didn't start because of a China containment or any anti-China thing. It started to try and save the Quad, or put something in place to substitute for where the Quad was. And certainly most of the development of that architecture has happened in a period, certainly from Australia's point of view, where China containment policies were not prominent in Australian foreign policy up until 2016, 2017. So most of the groundwork was laid at a period where that wasn't the dominant agenda, certainly from Australia's perspective, and I'd probably argue from Japan's as well for some of that time. Looking forwards, if the AJR coalition is about containing anyone, it's about containing the United States. There's been, the Trump administration has been extraordinarily destabilising and placed a lot of pressure on Australia and Japan as ally partners as well. India in different ways with some trade issues around GSP. And if the AJR work together to send a message to the US for first and foremost, now that once we've seen the Quad restarted, I think it's just been announced in the last hour, there'll be a Quad meeting in Tokyo next month. And so in a sense, I wouldn't say that's the principal motive. These governments will be talking, what's DC doing far more than, and how can we shape that more than what can we do to shape Beijing?
Very good. Priya?
Well, increasingly, initially, at least, I think it was about concerns about Chinese power and concerns about China dominating the region. However, in the last few years, clearly there are also concerns about US behaviour. So I see AGI as a way of actually asserting autonomy for all three countries. I think that all countries are actually moving closer to India's position of prioritising strategic autonomy. And one way to do it is by cultivating these trilateral relationships that are independent of both of the big great powers and actually trying to present these coalitions as trying to ameliorate great power competition in the region as well. I think that's an important function of trilateral institutions like this one.
Thank you. Now, before we wrap up, I want to get one final question in from our live audience right now. We have a question from Anil Jai Singh, who's the Vice President of the India Maritime Foundation. He did note that his middle name Jai could be a different variation of Aji if we just kind of reorganize it that way. But he noted that much of the discussion of this trilateral has been focused on the Pacific rather than the Indian Ocean side. So I wonder if I might get a real quick response from you first, Tomo, and then from you, Raji, on Australia, Japan, India cooperation in the Indian Ocean particularly. Tomo, to you.
Well, I can't, specify any cooperation, but probably infrastructure development or, maritime security or, MDA, as Raji mentioned, maritime domain awareness. Those are things, you can do wherever in the Pacific. So probably those are things we can collaborate in Indian Ocean as well.
Thank you. Raji, anything on that?
So I think I try to touch upon some of these aspects in my initial remarks, and that's that we need to have the three countries need to bring about greater coordination of their activities in terms of tracking maritime activities, naval activities of China in a very active fashion, because I think China has been creeping in the Indian Ocean region in a very systematic manner, initially through very legit routes, but I think there are also security related concerns that are coming about, for which I think, again, division of labor and some sort of a burden sharing arrangement need to happen among the three navies. These are the three capable navies, like I said, and I think that needs to happen. Second is also the MDA and the capacity building, and I think that's again, during peacetime, the three countries need to focus on. And I think for India, for instance, the submarine capabilities, I think that's submarine inventory has been going down. This is a clear area of strength on the part of the Japanese, and there is greater potential for India to look at collaborating with Japan in this regard, even though we have tried to go with France in the last few years. But I think greater coordination in order to monitor and track the Chinese activities in the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific waters, for me, is very important, including in the Indian Ocean.
Look, the indication of the quality of a discussion for me is the fact that we're at we're just 5 minutes left, and the number of new questions are just pouring in. We've got questions from the Netherlands, from Poland, from a former colleague of ours in South Korea, Kang San-ju. We're not going to be able to get to all those, and my apologies on that front. As we wrap up, what I'd like to do is bring on to the video right now Japan's ambassador to Australia, His Excellency Reiichiro Takahashi. Many of you may know that the seeds for this initial project came in our third annual Japan Symposium, with the Perth USAsia Centre has run every year for the last 3 years. This year's Japan Symposium was the last big public event we were able to do before COVID pushed us into the virtual realm. And we were then, as always, deeply fortunate to have input from and insight from one of the most insightful of Japan's diplomats, who served previously as Consul General in New York. So Ambassador Reiichiro Takahashi kindly agreed to do the foreword for the report that Priya and Jeff have authored, and he's also agreed to give us some concluding comments to wrap up our discussion today. So Ambassador Takahashi, thank you, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Good afternoon, Gordon. It's been a while.
It has been too long.
Well, I'm delighted to have been able to participate in today's event to launch the very timely report, Australia, Japan, and India, a trilateral coalition in the Indo-Pacific, authored by Priya and Jeffrey. I really enjoyed listening to the very high-quality discussion about this interesting topic. Also, my warm and wholehearted thanks to the panelists for today, Priya, Jeffrey, Raji, and Satake-san. Having said that, my impression, Gordon, is that you gave them a very difficult task intellectually, because as some of the panelists already mentioned, this format of trilateral cooperation, Japan, India, and Australia, is probably a difficult one to conceive. Satake-san already mentioned why 3. Is it just a sort of extension of a Quad minus United States? And is there any compelling reason why this has to be India, Japan, and Australia? This is a very difficult question to answer. So I think, Gordon, you intentionally gave them a very difficult homework, but they did their homework beautifully.
Indeed.
Couple of comments. Having said that, I think this trilateral format, trilateral coalition, is giving us a very interesting homework, because there is no fundamental conceptual reason why there have to be 3 of us. But at the same time, this is a very interesting combination of the country share the same value and are equipped with a different set of the assets to avail of, and also situated in a very different geographical circumstances. So I think the Trilateral coalition among among Japan, Australia, and India has to go through the test by the project, not by the concepts. We have to find a good project to go for. In recent years, for instance, what I found most interesting is the cooperative project between Japan, India, and Sri Lanka for the development port of Sri Lanka, because this is giving us a very interesting cases for the three countries to cooperate with each other. So my personal wishes is the three countries should work hard to find a good project to work with. There are many possible potential projects, and one of which may be working on the Mekong River Basin development, for which Japan, Australia, and India, each of those countries have a different asset to cooperate with. Another thing I'd like to point out is I may have some reservation to name this coalition a middle power cooperation. I mean, definition of a middle power now changed, especially in this changing strategic landscape. Probably we have to revisit the concept of middle power cooperation, middle power itself, before we sort of name it middle power cooperation. Thirdly, again, I think I made this point the last time I attended the same types of seminar under your guidance, Gordon. In the economic field, we and I am of the view that the greatest missed opportunity for our country is the hesitancy coming from India to participate in RCEP. In the post-corona period, when we talk about the necessity to re-establish the supply chain globally, the best way for us to go for, and the best way for India to be powerful in this process is to participate in RCEP. Maybe Raji has a different opinion, but I strongly believe that the door is open for India to participate in RCEP, and countries like Japan is trying very hard to make window as open as possible for India to participate. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Takahashi, thank you for your time today, for your leadership on these very issues, for your willingness to author the foreword to the report. We couldn't have had a more fulsome discussion. Again, congratulations to Priya and Jeff on the report. It not only laid the foundation that we discussed today, but also set somewhat of a roadmap going forward for many of the issues that Ambassador Takahashi just addressed. And again, allow me to express our particular thanks to our partners today, to the Organization Research Foundation, to the National Institute for Defense Studies. We look forward to cooperating with you. For those of you who have not read the report, there will be a link to it when this video comes out in a recorded version, and there'll also be a link to it on our website. It certainly is well worth the read, and that's something where I think there will be no aji-baji about it whatsoever. So thank you all. Look forward to joining you in the future. Sorry about that, Jeff.